Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for attending the Community Land Trust presentation for more affordable, connected, and sustainable housing in Aotearoa, and for joining Samuel Johnston and myself, Zola Rose of Common Ground. I thought I'd start us with a quick karakia in English, which honors our time of gathering today. So we are gathering in our own spaces, and so that is the title of the reading, Gathering in Our Own Spaces. Come, gather, not into a common space, sharing a physical closeness we long for, precluded by wise choice, but come gather into this common time and a common space. We need to be together. We yearn for connection. We hunger for the familiar faces of friends, the sound of shared voices proclaiming who we are, where we are going, that which resonates with our hopes, our dreams, our values. Come, gather. We are here in this space, made of all spaces, and may we share our becoming in this moment. So thank you all. Nice to see you. Ashley, Mateo, Ingrid, and our co-presenter, Samuel Johnston, all coming in from different parts.
Yes, hello. I'm Samuel Johnston calling in from Permaculture, which is in South Auckland. Nice to meet you.
Thank you all very much for coming. Samuel and I are sharing this presentation. You might know a little bit about my interest in Community Land Trust if you had a chance to look at the videos that I have got on the Common Ground YouTube channel. There were two that I think I sent a link to that you would have seen or that you could see that's talking about the model in general, how generally it works in mostly the United States and the United Kingdom. And then I helped to promote it, champion it, and get it established here in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton. It is in its new phase at the moment where it's just been established as a nonprofit entity with charity status to be able to receive funding, hasn't yet got land, has a board of, I think, 6 people. So I can't really talk too much to the Community Land Trust that here in Hamilton, except that council has come on board as a partner, which is really wonderful. And it's got a board that is having some experience in this space of housing and working with trust and with working with the community part. And so it's a wonderful thing to have started it and have one established here officially here in Kirikiriroa. I'm looking forward to being able to share with you all, if you stay connected on the Common Ground newsletter, as we progress here in Hamilton, I'll be able to share stories of how it takes form, because you'll find in our presentation, there's so many different forms of the Community Land Trust that it's going to take its own unique shape here in this city. And my personal interest is that I'm interested in justice. And so I come from a real justice lens of the Community Land Trust being a way to bring justice to marginalized people, as well as even marginalized land. I think in this country, we've sort of commodified land, and we've kind of gotten separated from our connection with land. And so part of it is, for me, bringing in those aspects of regenerative development, which is regenerating the soil and our environment, as well as communities and our economy.
Okay, yeah, kia ora everybody. Be good to catch up with that video. I enjoyed that video that I did with you, Zola, about the general features of the Community Land Trust. I don't want to go into any lengthy bio. I just want to say 2 points probably. I'm currently practicing in property law and trusts law at a law firm in South Auckland. And a lot of that work is about private trusts, but we do have some work in charitable trusts. There's a bit of an interface there between the history of land tenure in the country and charitable trusts, which we'll go into later. The other thing that I've got is an ongoing interest in research. I've done a lot of research projects, legal research projects over time. Initially, a lot of my research looked at the history of land tenure in the UK and New Zealand, and it was actually through the lens of land tax rather than land tenure. And this research project, which I finished in 2019, sort of like the evolution of that project in a way. It's sort of like land tenure being the other side of the coin of land tax and all the different movements in history, which were seeking to have economic justice through centralized systems, including taxation. So I still am involved with the academic world, and I like to combine both academic interests and practicing interests, and particularly passionate about connecting grassroots groups too to those two interests of mine. And so that's what I hope to contribute.
Kia ora, Samuel. Fantastic, great. I'm going to again go back to sharing the screen that we had earlier, just to start with. We're actually going to start with some international examples, just to give you an idea of the history, very briefly, because we want to focus on Aotearoa, but just to show you that it does have a long-standing success rate. Just going to share that screen. Here we go. Let me know if you can see that. Can you all see the slide? Yep, okay. So I just, in my research, I found two from America, and Samuel has others. So there's the Dudley Street, which is 1984 established, and it was a countering gentrification in this particular area of Boston, Massachusetts in America. And their focus is about development without displacement. So housing was one of the first pieces, but they've since grown to include the environment. As you see in this photo, they also do a lot of land-based things in the neighborhood. So they're, it's bigger than housing now. It's about, regenerating the community and about resilience for the community and the different forms that that can take. And that is still a very active community land trust. You can check that out, Dudley Street neighborhood. And then the other long-standing one, it's actually the biggest one in America. It has over 2,000 houses or people, because they take the form of apartments and of individual homes and a variety of things in between. It's a nice community land trust to look at because it does have such a variety of different tenure and housing types. And it's been very long-standing in that community also, I think, for the last 20 years or so. And it changed names. It was originally, I think, the Burlington Community Land Trust, and it's now named itself the Champlain Housing Trust. So that's another one you can check out online, which is got really fantastic resources on there to learn from. So I'll hand it over to you now, Sam, to take over the presentation. And what you would like to share, that is next, or would you like to start with something else?
Maybe if I give a bit of context, and then we can go to the flower slide after that, perhaps. Yeah, okay, cool. Thanks very much for those examples, Zola. I think there's a lot of cool stuff that's been going on, really pioneered since the good old days. It was the civil rights movement in the US, wasn't it, as we talked about in the last video. But really, I want to focus on Aotearoa today in New Zealand and look at the specifics of the legal conditions and other conditions and see how we can implement them. But before we get into sort of legal specifics, I want to just give some context as to why the model in general is relevant for Aotearoa today. So first of all, in terms of housing law and policy, I think it's a realistic approach to some of the pitfalls of our current housing paradigm. The reason I think it's realistic is because it's localized. It doesn't require a top-down centralized solution. It can be tailored to local conditions, and it's a incremental approach to adjusting land tenure as opposed to a one-size-fits-all approach. I think that's quite an affinity with our cultural and constitutional contexts in New Zealand, and the realities of regulating land in this country is it has to be a step-by-step process. In New Zealand, we have a really rich tradition of community-led housing, and particularly with communities who have had ecological aspirations. And the Community Land Trust weaves together those themes of community and sustainability in a unique way. And so we can borrow from what's been learned and then take this sort of brand new model, subject to some, I think Mateo will know a little bit about Kotari Village, given that he's lived there for a few years, and see how it's best to be tailored to our context in Aotearoa. And the other thing I'm quite excited about is the Community Land Trust scope for two things really: housing as a human right in New Zealand, promoting autonomy and dignity of people in our housing market, and also with respect to the Treaty of Waitangi, really addressing housing obligations in a meaningful way in that sphere. And I think we'll talk later about the interface between papakinga and other constitutional themes and how we can meet up New Zealand's constitution and property arrangements on a local basis. So those are sort of 3 points of why it's relevant. And I wonder if I give a little outline of 3 basic things I want to cover in terms of content today. The first thing I want to do is sketch out a normative framework for the evaluation of community legal structures. That's community-led housing and also intentional communities, with a focus on basically the first few core ones. And the second thing I want to do is look at a few case studies and see what's been done in New Zealand, what's been tried out, and what points we can learn. Then I want to go through it's called the hybrid community land trust model, which I set out in my thesis, which I'm arguing is probably a good way to, going forward, to take all these things that have been learned and bring together grassroots groups and stakeholders and others and getting some action going. So those are the 3 sort of components to the content of what I want to share today. And now I think we can have a look at David Holmgren's permaculture flower, if we could, please, Zola.
Yep.
And so I got in touch with David Holmgren and asked him to include his permaculture flower in my thesis. And he gave me the green light, so that's cool. This is David Holmgren, co-founder of Permaculture. His concept of what sustainability as an overarching goal is perceived to encompass. Probably people with us today and maybe people listening will know quite a lot about permaculture, but in summary, it's a ecological design system that attempts to build a good place to live. And it's developed over time, but I really like this permaculture flower because it shows all the different domains which people can bring expertise to. And my focus today with this land tenure stuff is basically the 2 petals on the left of the flower: land tenure and community governance, and finance and economics. Those are sort of quite foundational ones, building blocks, if you will, for the other stuff in the real world, the visible structures as opposed to the invisible structures that we need to work together to achieve the overarching goal of sustainability. So I reckon that's pretty good for that one, Zola. Have we got another slide about that? Yeah, cool. So this is a framework, and I set this out just so that we can have lenses or angles to view different legal structures used by communities and in housing developments. I'm not going to talk about each criterion in a lot of detail in terms of theory and case studies. I'll refer people to the actual full-length thesis for that. I'll just sketch a little bit about each, particularly the first ones. So in terms of vision statement, this asks, how holistic is the purpose of the organization or the community group? And what is it seeking to achieve? So do its aspirations look towards social aspirations, ecological aspirations, and maybe even economic aspirations with regard to the status of land? And the outcome might be quite different depending on how holistic the aims are of the group. And we'll see that depending on context and purpose of different developments, vision statements might have very different scope and have ramifications for legal structure design and affordability and other things. Right, number 2 is mission controlled and effective governance. And this is quite an interesting criterion to look at what happens in the absence of an appropriate legal mechanism here. And there's an interesting case study in my work about that, which really highlights its importance. But for today's purposes, I just want to emphasize that the legal structure needs to be functional in the first point and enable binding decisions to be made. And the consideration really when we compare different legal structures is who holds power ultimately, and how should power be shared? And different developments will have different emphases or different balances in the power, depending on the nature of the vision of property, really, with private developments and community land trusts, quite different arrangements. Number 3 is security of tenure. This looks at, for individuals residing in these places, is their tenure secure in time and space? And another factor of it is if they do stuff to improve the land, maybe they build a house or expand a house, is that recognized, those contributions, are they recognized if they seek to leave the community? Okay, number 4 is about protecting affordability. This is one of the key themes of the Community Land Trust movement. Sort of decommoditizing the land is the sort of theme with that model. And I guess the protecting affordability, it looks at what happens over time for different legal structures. So they might start out, particularly in developments with titles with good aspirations for a holistic vision of sustainability, but the land market sort of might price out young people eventually, or shift it from an inclusive model to a enclave for the affluent and things like that, the old gentrification theme. So is there a mechanism to safeguard affordability and meet the interests of young people over time and other people seeking to join the community or the development? All right, so those are the 4 core ones I want to focus on today. I think the next slide has 2 others which are worth considering. We got that one there, Zola, please.
Yep. Is it this one? Yep.
Yeah, that's it. So the other 2 which I want to focus on today, well, number 5 is mechanism for commons management. So which is the appropriate entity for managing commons facilities? And this might be the same as, some communities use the same entity as the landholding entity. Other communities use a different entity or approach. It might not be an incorporated entity. And so what are the pluses and minuses of that? And really a key one for today's purposes and for New Zealand is the stakeholder finance limb or criterion. And there's 2 aspects to this. First of all, in the establishment phase of the community, when the community is being set up, it looks at, well, the project will be very hungry for capital. So what are the sources of capital? Are you reliant on residents' capital alone, a purely private venture? Or do you have other sources of capital from other stakeholders? And who might those be? That's number 6. Oh, and the other thing about stakeholder finance is this, when it's set up, is there a provision for individuals who want to join the community once it's all set up to get a loan to purchase a house, say, within the community? Or do they need to rely on their own resources like their savings or some private arrangement? Whether there's an institutional structure for finance to support a community. Okay, and quickly, the last few are the membership process, which needs to be clear and transparent. The economic base, people in a community need to be able to make a living, and that's particularly relevant for rural communities and eco-villages. And I think we've got 3 more, hey, Zola?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. This number 9 is quite interesting. I actually learned this one from Robina McCurdy, who's a eco-village and community pioneer, and it's inwardness and outwardness. And she says, does the community have an outreach or outlooking component, or is it purely for the self-gratification of its members? And I think that this hits on something quite useful, and that's to be dynamic and vibrant places over time, it needs to have some kind of outward component within its legal structure. And the last 2 are conflict resolution. Are there binding mechanisms in place for conflict, which will inevitably occur? And where are these located? And number 11 is, how about older people when they become elderly? Is there something in the design of the structure of the community that meets their interests and needs appropriately? So those are the criteria, I think, yeah. So if we got, I wonder if we can, yeah, we'll finish with a slide. And so I think that it's probably worth just briefly recapping the core features of the Community Land Trust, maybe in light of the first 3 criteria, 3 or 4, and then we'll jump into some case studies. So as I said before, the vision of the Community Land Trust is to decommoditize the land. So rather than owning it for individuals to personally own it, benefit from it, and profit upon capital gains of it, the model is that the land is owned for the common good, and what that entails is a broader version of, well, a broader vision of property perhaps than private property that we're used to in New Zealand. Governance in the community land trust is tripartite traditionally, which means that it's not just residents controlling the land and the organisation, but others. And for security of tenure, there are long-term leaseholds usually with resale price restrictions. So that keeps the lease affordable while giving people a fair valuation for improvements, say the house that they own. All right, cool. So that's the land trust. Now, have we got some pictures, Zola, of what's our first case study? Karuna Falls, is it?
Oh, yep. I'll
yeah,
get
cool.
to that.
You got
now.
those pictures?
Get down to that slide. So I guess here's where they all are, just to give an overview.
That's handy. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's the one. Cool. I like this map. Okay. So here's Aotearoa. All these communities are quite different legal structures, and it's worth, we'll do a little survey of each of them, sketching out their core structures. And we're going to start with a rural community, Karuna Falls. Can we go back to the map, maybe, Zola? Or that maybe it speaks for itself. Yeah, so we'll go Karuna Falls, then the Quaker Settlement, then Earthsong Eco Village, Atamai, and Mateo's Kotari Village. We'll have a look at that one too and have a good chat about that afterwards. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Karuna Falls, shall we look at? Yeah, so Karuna Falls, the cooperative model is quite a popular model overseas, and it's sort of considered to be popular within alternative housing development circles in New Zealand. So I thought it was worth starting with this model to highlight some of the cool stuff about it and also some of the limitations of this particular model. So we've got here, this is the entrance sign to the Karuna Falls land. It was 750 acres that they bought in the 1970s, 1976 in the Coromandel. And when they bought it, it was blackened off by the farmer who had owned it in the practice of burn off. And so over the next, well, to date, really, they've been regenerating the landscape and replanting trees. A lot of kiwi live in the bush now and kereru, and it's a really beautiful landscape. So shall we look at one of the cottages there, the next picture, Zola? Yeah, so this is a picture of an example of one of the rustic dwellings that are dotted throughout the landscape. You can see it's not a mass-produced McMansion by any means, and I think that's enough of that. And let's look at their common house, please, Zola. And this is the very substantial common house at Karuna Falls, made of really solid wood, recycled materials, basically. And this is co-owned by the cooperative. Yeah, so that just gives you a sketch of the type of dwellings that are at the landscape. And maybe we'll talk about the legal structure now, shall we? Yeah, cool. So this community owns land as a cooperative society. It's incorporated under the quite old-sounding Industrial and Providence Societies Act 1908. And so all the dwellings for that community are on one title, which is owned by the society, and that's their governance entity. Then individual residents have a license to occupy their individual sites, and that's set out as a GPS point on their license. Then they can build a house on it or buy a house on it, and it secures individual tenure. They've got a pretty good inward-outward flow at Karuna. They're quite well known as a permaculture outpost in New Zealand. And that common house has been used over the years for permaculture education and other things. Yeah, so it's a pretty great place and ticks a lot of boxes of those criteria that we went through. And I guess the one thing to focus on for present needs is stakeholder finance. Now, because the license that they have is not a sort of title to the land or a security that banks will recognize, basically there's not a financial infrastructure at the village, Karuna Falls, community. They all have to rely on their own resources to have the capital to buy or to construct a dwelling. So they do have second and third generation members who have joined up. So it's a thriving and vibrant community. But in some ways, it's not perhaps scalable to other contexts in New Zealand because of the construction costs and other requirements that are involved in financing new dwellings like this. So, so that's Karuna Falls. I think we'll look at another case study now, shall we, Zola?
Okay, I'll bring that up.
Okay, cool. So this is the Quaker Settlement in Wanganui. This was set up at a similar time, actually, in 1975. And Karuna Falls was a huge block of land, 700 something acres. This site's a bit smaller. It's a 20-acre site. And there's 16 homes on it, and they surround an education centre. In this community too, all the dwellings are on one title. And the underlying entity is actually a charitable trust which owns this land, like many others of the communities in New Zealand. So I think I'll talk about governance of this trust a little bit, and then we'll talk about the license a little bit more. So this trust is quite interesting because like the Community Land Trust, majority control is not held by the residents. The residents of the Quaker Settlement have day-to-day management power devolved to them by the board, but they don't have ultimate power in terms of what happens on the land. It's actually three members of the board of a total of 12 are nominated by residents, and the remaining 9 are nominated by the wider Quaker community in New Zealand. And so this is interesting because it's enabled the settlement to access the wider financial resources of the Quaker organisation, and also a lot of the expertise which has been contributed in terms of evolving the physical, architectural and financial infrastructure of the whole settlement over time. And in particular, residents here, even though they own a license to occupy, they're able to get funding through a loan, or they have been traditionally, through a loan through it's the Quaker Ethical Investment Trust. So they don't need to have the full purchase price to be able to buy a license to occupy at the settlement. They can if they want to, otherwise they can apply for a loan. It was traditionally through that trust, and then perhaps through other Quaker lending arrangements. So it's sort of the benefit, the cost, I guess, of not having majority resident control is less power, but the benefit here is they've got access to those resources from the wider organisation. Now, the valuation of the licenses here is basically there's no individual ownership of land, and what residents own is the value of the license, which is the value of the house itself, excluding land value. So when they buy it, they might buy a license for $120,000. And then if they leave the community or pass away, the surrender value of the license is basically a similar capital sum. So this is the settlement. You can see the whole site from the air. Thank you, Zola. And you can see a lot of solar panels on the function center, which is in the middle next to where the driveway is. And so it's a really beautiful site with permaculture-based plantings and land care. I think we have one more picture, don't we, of this is the site looking at the education center in the middle. Then you can see up at the rear, there's some pasture, which they have sheep on, a woodlot that's on the top of the hill, and going over behind there, there's some other more woodlot. And then you can see on the left of this picture some really awesome regenerated native bush, and there's an ongoing program there for planting and healing up the land, building the soil. So yeah, it's a really beautiful site, ticks so many boxes in so many ways. And yeah, there's the thing about this place and Karuna Falls too to mention is that here residents have completely separate finances. They're not like the 1970s commune, if you will. They sort of have their own individual spaces and shared responsibility for different areas of the site. But most residents work in Wanganui, which is just basically 5-minute drive away in the car. So it's a really great site. I should say many of them cycle to work too. So that's good. Really great feel and really great values permeate the whole site here. Okay, so that's the Quaker Settlement, 1970s. Now what are we looking at? So now we're going to look at two newer type developments. This is the newer generation of eco-village or eco-neighbourhood. And Earthsong, again, is a really beautiful site in Ranui in West Auckland. This was set up by Robin Ellison and some of her friends in the late 1990s. And it's a community of 32 households on a green co-housing model. And this is held under the Unit Titles Act, which is a statutory framework for the ownership of private units. They're called principal units. And then the commons are owned by the body corporate. And so it's quite a specific statutory framework for what's required in terms of body corporate duties and what you can and can't do if you're seeking to have some kind of intentional community and maybe have some restrictions on price and membership. So I guess the key theme about Earthsong is that it was a great success to set up, and they did really well to get bank lending to finance the development. And basically the reason I think that Robin says that they got lending is because it was a registerable estate under that act, and they got 100% of pre-sales at the time. And so even though it was a novel and risky, well, from the bank's point of view, risky development, and they set it up, and it's still going and a great success today. But I guess one of the trade-offs with using the Unit Titles Act is that there's not that same scope. It's a bit more difficult to tailor any restrictions in affordability. So this development has followed the Auckland property market really in basically unconstrained capital growth, capital gains of the units, and with the concomitant implications that even though there might be something, nice vision statement about ecological sustainability, it might not strike great success in the deeper aspects of social sustainability, balanced demographics, and of course, economic sustainability. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to say. Another thing to mention about Earthsong is, what pictures have we got there, Zola? Cool. So you can see there's the figure 8 loop that goes through the site. And at the top of this figure 8 loop is a very substantial and beautiful common house. And interestingly, this common house is owned part by the body corporate, and another portion of it, 35%, is owned by a charitable trust. And this was to reflect Waitakere City Council's contribution of the construction costs. And so with this common house, it reflects their private usage of community meals, things like that. But it also reflects the public value and the public contribution of the construction of it via public outreach and education activities, which they hold regularly at that beautiful common house. And do we have one more picture there, Zola? So this is one of the paths on the figure 8 loop at Earthsong. And if you walk around that site, you can get a really lovely feel for its sort of very humane architectural design and also the social aspects of it. You know, the fortuitous bumping into your neighbour along the way as you're walking to the car park, which is at the edge of the site. So I think the key thing is going forward is thinking about how can we retain that lovely demographic balance with children being able, and families with children being able to afford this kind of place, and what's the appropriate legal mechanism to do so. Yeah, there's been an interesting Supreme Court case. I don't think I'll talk about that in detail today, but there is case law on body corporate rules and what you can and can't do. And so that's something to consider for future eco neighbourhoods who are adopting this legal structure. Here's Atamai village. I wonder if we'll go through the pictures of this one a bit more briefly, and then we'll sort of, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail after that. So this is an artist's sketch of the permaculture concept of Atamai, which got going in 2006. I think we've got some houses of Atamai in the next picture. Yeah, so this is what the land looks like on the ground. You can see some nicely constructed houses, pretty robust constructions, and some of them are very substantial. Then we can see some nice plantings on some of the areas there. And I think we've got a picture of the water in the next one. So this is some of the reservoir or ponds really that have been constructed. And the physical aspect of Atamai's water design is quite interesting, with water sources, you know, aiming for resilience and being located at different points of the property. Yeah, so that's cool. I wonder, I think that's it for those pictures. Yeah, kia ora. So for Atamai's legal structure, this is an interesting model because it uses individual titles, which is something which is very familiar to property law practitioners. Probably it's fair to say that if you can get away in a development with titles, then that will be the preference as opposed to the Unit Titles Act, just as a sort of go-to of practice. But so rather than the body corporate owning anything, in Atamai, there's a 26-acre common area, which is very sophisticatedly planted with permaculture design and orchards and other things, and a really valuable resource. And that is actually owned by an incorporated society. And what happens is each title has a covenant which causes the title owner to be a member of the society. And so they get the benefits of the common area, and also they pay a levy to that entity for the upkeep and costs of maintenance of it. And yeah, so Atamai, I think they had a little bumpy road, which I don't need to discuss. I think the original project was aiming for about 50 households. They actually ended up with substantially less than that. And so I think there's currently maybe about 12 or so completed dwellings, and then scope to increase the number there as things progress, but certainly not to the scale that was originally envisaged. In terms of price dynamics at Atamai, that's another consideration. It's in just outside of Motueka, and basically the freehold titles, well, the good thing is you can get bank lending for it because it's a registerable security, fee simple estate and land is what it's called, basically a title. But the trade-off is that they're susceptible to the fluctuations of the wider Motueka and top of the South Island land market. And so it starts off as quite an expensive development. And then there's nothing, sort of no regulation in terms of seeking to keep it affordable over time. So the question is, going forward, can we take some of the best bits of that type of development with titles, but then look about tailoring it in light of a more holistic vision statement? Yeah, and I think that we can. So what have we got there? Now, oh, that's right, we've got one more. It's not to be missed is after Atamai, let's talk a little bit about Kotari village, Mateo. So I think we've got some pictures of Kotari here. Yeah, so this was I actually did my permaculture design course at Kotari village in 2017, and had a really great time meeting everybody and getting to know the founders of the village, Bob Corker and Kay Baxter. And they had a really interesting story, which Bob has put a video on YouTube about how they had an eco-village, a great eco-village in many ways, up in Kaiwaka in Northland, and then became dissatisfied at the operation of the basically unconstrained capital growth in land and how it limits your vision for sustainability and the ability to make a living off the land, because everybody's busy paying their mortgages, or only, you know, elderly people can afford to buy into the development. So this was their project. It's the first community land trust in New Zealand. And you can see that it's a rural context with the middle block and housing sites and some other functions in that middle block. And then plenty of space outside that middle block for farming activities and regenerative activities. And I think the next slide shows us the Koanga Institute, which I'm sure Mateo has had plenty of involvement with. This is the organization that runs the educational activities out of Kotari Village. And it's well known in New Zealand for heritage seed saving and other research projects into regenerative agriculture and gardening, and also regenerative living and healthy eating. And this picture here is of their urban garden project. And that's something that I learned about at Kotari Village and took back to our section in Papakura and made up, just, you know, trying to implement things that I've learned from all the great people at Kotari. And we've got one more picture, I think, Zola, of a concept for the home block, the middle block at Kotari Village, really based on a strong understanding of permaculture design principles, with the Koanga Institute located in the center of the village, being sort of like a practical and intellectual life, life center of the village. And then individual houses in housing clusters with sun trap plantings being the intended design. Then a few facilities that were existing on the land that they bought, and then a few structures which are planned, such as a public-faced retail site. So pretty cool design. And let's see now about their legal structure, how they got on and what choices they made. Cool. So Kotari Village chose a charitable trust as the landowning entity, which is a long-standing choice for many communities in New Zealand. And then the model that they adopted was individual leases of sites to protect the individual tenure. And I think that Kotari Village tick a lot of the boxes of that framework in terms of having a very holistic vision statement and really seeking to protect affordability in a provision in their lease document, which basically means that you can't have a capital gain on the lease interest. And they certainly have, in my experience, have a good inward-outward flow in terms of the educational aspects of the village and inviting people in to come and learn. And I guess similar to some of the earlier communities, such as Karuna Falls, one sort of aspect which might be considered to have room for improvement is the financial structure of the development. So this was a pretty grassroots development, as I understand it, and they had access to some financial resources for the initial purchase price, but there's not that same facility as the Quakers structure to have individual residents to access finance to purchase or construct dwellings on the site. So individuals need to have a lot of capital up front if they're wanting, or access to it at least, from maybe private sources, if they're wanting to join the village, buy a lease, and then build the house on the village. So so Kotari's governance structure, if we refer to that and consider how the community land trust traditionally might differ a little bit, is basically a two-tier structure. And the first tier is the individual residents who have basically half of the board, the Kotari Community Trust Board, is elected by the residents through their organisation. And then the other component of the board is the trustees from time to time of the Koanga Institute has an equal number of trustees to the residents of Kotari Village. So this is sort of like a rolling eldership, it's been called by its founders. And I think that the real virtue of that is that it's not purely resident control alone. So it sort of has an additional safeguard of the kaupapa of the development or the village, and makes sure that their values are safeguarded and not radically innovated in terms of just what's in the short-term benefit of the interests, the residents of the village from time to time. So that's great. But one of the things that research has shown in community land trusts overseas is that a really important part of the model is the stakeholder class. And it might be a local authority or some other kind of ethical lender who is involved in the development, and they basically, there's a trade-off between a bit of sharing of power in return for a bit of financial support, and it might be financial capital, it might be via planning permission of a local authority to add value to the land in that way. So I wonder if we could look now at, I think that brings the case studies, I think that's enough to say about those. So if we sketch out a little bit about Papakainga, and then we can have a look at at the model which I'm proposing. So maybe.
So should I share it now or wait?
Yeah, maybe we'll wait a little bit, okay. Could we, Zola? And I'll talk a little bit about it, and then we'll look at specifics of it.
I really just want to draw your attention to it's 12:55, and we have a half an hour left. We want to leave substantial time for Q&A.
Yeah, okay. So let's run through that quickly. Yeah. So in terms of Papakainga and the Community Land Trust model, I think I'll just flag that this has been noted in the Maori Law Review, that they share substantial similarity of aims. So things like maintaining affordability, bringing people to the land, stewarding land for future generations. And the key point for the Community Land Trust model is that a statutory incorporation or trust under the Maori Land Act will hold the land, and residents own a license to occupy, similar to the Quaker model, and the value of the license is basically the value of the house. And the key point that we can learn from Papakainga is that there's finance for these type projects by means of a tripartite finance agreement between the Maori Trust or incorporation and the resident and Kiwi Bank, actually, and Housing New Zealand or Kāinga Ora are aligned with Kiwi Bank in terms of the financial stakeholder. They both play a role in putting the money up and enforcing the security interest over the house alone if there's a problem with the repayment. But I think that it's quite, in terms of the mechanics, that's quite a good thing to learn. It's also great to highlight the aligned visions between Papakainga and community land trusts, with Papakainga taking on permaculture type visions, and then grassroots community groups adopting some tikanga principles in their own developments, which are not necessarily on land held under the Māori Land Act. Right, so I wonder if we can look at this example here, maybe Zola. Yeah, so this briefly is one example of an eco-village, grassroots eco-village development, which is adopted with sort of guidance from Mana Whenua, have adopted many of the values which are inherent in the Te Ao Māori worldview. And I think that this is quite an exciting convergence for law in New Zealand, where we involve these deep-running values of this land in different community-based property arrangements going forward. So I wonder, last thing I really want to do in terms of content is look at that proposed sketch, Zola, that last slide, please. Are you able to pull up the, yeah, that's the one. So this is one community group's concept of a community-led housing design based on permaculture and tikanga principles. And this is a rural context design, but it could be tailored to a more urban design if you take away some of the farmland in the bottom of the picture, and maybe have denser individual housing units. As you can see, there's the two clusters of housing. But basically, there's a public face zone in this in this development concept, where you might have businesses, things like that. Then up the top, in the middle of the top of the picture, there's various community facilities, and they might be a common house, which might have a charitable trust or something doing education stuff. Might have other residence facilities, maybe a teenager hangout space or a shared laundry or whatever. And then you've got the two clusters of housing. And my suggestion is that, just to be able to visualize the legal structure that I'm going to run through, is if you look at each cluster, there's an outer perimeter of houses, and going around that ring road there, or ring path. And I would suggest that those types of houses might be held in titles, and then the houses on the inside of the cluster might be held under licenses to occupy, or possibly leases, depending on the planning context. And yeah, there's a nice community orchard in this picture, and plenty water supply and other physical factors for resilient design. I think that's it for the slide, Zola. We don't need that one. Yeah. So I wonder if we finish with the slides, and I'll just run through this hybrid model, which I've come to in the conclusion of my research, and then we maybe have a bit of a chat about it with everybody. So in terms of the vision statement, I mean, that's up to the community group itself and their particular context, and whatever they are aspiring to, that is what they're going to express, and it will shape their legal structure. But I really liked that expression of tikanga in that particular eco-village's vision statement, with all those great values like kaitiakitanga and whanaunatanga and manaakitanga, that really make it quite unique to our conditions, and imbuing all these property arrangements with the deeper values of this land. Now, if we turn to ownership and governance, I'm actually proposing in my hybrid model to have an incorporated society as the landholding entity, rather than a charitable trust. And I talk a little bit about the case law and the challenges that a charitable trust poses if it's the complete landholding entity. And my suggestion is that on the Earthsong model, a charitable trust would be better owning a portion of the common facilities, perhaps with a clear public function, such as education of the wider community, and that the CLT entity which holds the land be an incorporated society. Now, our Incorporated Societies Act is just before Parliament, and either later this year, probably next year, due to all the COVID delays, we're going to have a brand new Incorporated Societies Act. It's quite a sophisticated act, and it mirrors the director's duties of the Companies Act in terms of society officers, so that there's security and accountability. There's some really big incorporated societies in New Zealand, like the New Zealand Rugby Union, which hold millions, or like hundreds of millions of dollars of assets. And so it's a secure entity for a community land trust with a clearly drafted constitution to be able to hold a substantial piece of land. The governance of the society, the CLT entity as an incorporated society, I'm proposing to have tripartite governance on the classic model. Basically, I think it's a great balance to have 1/3 residents, and they would elect 1/3 of the board, and then another third of financial stakeholders, might be local government or other financial stakeholders, maybe community finance or some other ethical lender that has a kaupapa that is aligned with the CLT. And then 1/3, I think there's a real role in our country to have mana whenua and other members of the local community and civil society as to be involved in the governance of the organization. Now, this is quite a novel proposal because it's sort of diffusing property, which has been rather centralized in our vision of property, out to other interest groups and giving them a say in governance. And it's quite novel for a private property arrangement. So in terms of the community land trust model, it's always been a quasi-public entity, actually. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily a purely private development. And I think it's, there's constitutional developments in other places in New Zealand in terms of the Whanganui River Agreement having dual governance between the Crown and iwi. And I think that in these land trust arrangements, there's a real scope for mana whenua and other people aligned with the kaupapa of the land trust to be involved in governance. But ultimately it's governed by a board which is chosen by these people. And so it relies a bit on democracy, much more democratic element than traditional charitable trusts, say the Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust, which is basically by appointment, and it's quite autocratic in its control of the property. Now that's secure, but I think that there's a real role for a more democratic vision of property as I'm proposing here. The only other two which I want to talk about in terms of this model, they're sort of interrelated actually, is security of tenure and affordability. Now, this hybrid model needs to be affordable, and it also needs to be able to capitalize the project so that it's financially viable. So I'm proposing in this model a mix of, or a layer of tenure interests. There's both licenses to occupy on the Papakainga and Quaker model, and also titles. Now, some of those titles might be free market titles, but other titles could be shared equity arrangements, which would make them more affordable. And I would suggest that the UK's approach to shared equity in community land trusts, I haven't sort of covered it yet, but I'll just mention it now, is the appropriate mechanism. And that basically means that if there's a shared equity arrangement, capital gains are regulated by a formula and not lost by the land trust. So that keeps these shared equity arrangements affordable over time. In terms of the membership of the community land trust, these tenure instruments would cause membership. And in the license instrument, it's quite easy to write in a provision that the licensee will join this resident class of the land trust as a member. And in terms of titles, I think Atamai got it right in that there's a covenant on the title causing membership. And I think that's sufficient, and it just needs to be drafted in the right way, the covenant, to make sure that it's legally enforceable. I think that the cool thing about having layered tenure interests is that it promotes economic integration. So rather than having polarity in terms of the owners all being wealthy and then the people who want to live in an eco-village all locked out, you can have a mix of demographics and a mix of income types based on what people can afford, with the key theme being that it's going to be affordable over time. In terms of commons management, there's two more aspects to this design. For commons management, I've chosen a cooperative society under the, just like Karuna Falls actually, as the entity which manages commons areas. And there's a few reasons for that, which I won't go into in too much detail now. I'll refer you to my full-length thesis for that. But basically the vision of property, or the version of property under an incorporated society, is the appropriate one to manage common areas. And it also might own some facilities. Say, for example, it might own the community house, which is on the land trust land. And that might be in whole, or it might be a portion, like in the Earthsong model. So that would be a joint ownership agreement. But all those specifics will depend on funding, actually. And yeah, so if we come to the crucial criterion of funding and stakeholder finance, it depends a little bit on who comes to the party and advocacy before different stakeholders by the proponents of the land trust. But the ideal scenario would be to have and there's precedent for this actually in the US models and UK, is to have partnership with their local authority, which contributes to the initial capitalization of the land trust. Because really, if it's going to be a quasi-public entity, residents shouldn't have to pay the full purchase price for the land up front. And then the other thing is further stakeholder finance for dwellings could be arranged via a scheme like the Kāinga Whenua loan scheme for Papakainga, or through another ethical lender, such as I've mentioned community finance, but really any organization which has capital and supports the kaupapa of the land trust, and then is willing to come to the party and have a bit of control in return for a bit of support in terms of that democratic participation. So that's the sort of hybrid model that I've come to. It's got a vision, it's got governance of the entity, it's got secure tenure of mixed types, it's got an entity to manage common areas and facilities, and it's got finance available both for starting up the project and in an ongoing way. And so that's the sort of conclusion of the content of what I wanted to share about community land trusts. Thank you for your patience in going through all those different criteria. It does assume a little bit a knowledge of different interests in terms of the difference between a lease and a license and a estate and land, either fee simple or unit titles. And I'm happy to sort of, I guess we can elaborate on that either today or in subsequent questions, or if you want to email me, I can refer you to the information, which is all out there, because that's general information about the legal structure of New Zealand rather than the specific model which I'm proposing. Okay, so thank you for listening.